Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tristan Claridge, and it's a pleasure to be with you for another session of our webinar series. Since 2020, these webinars have been a space where ideas and practice come together, where researchers, practitioners, and thoughtful colleagues gather to explore what social capital is, why it matters, and how we can apply it in real-world contexts. At the International Social Capital Association, our mission is to deepen understanding and strengthen action around social capital. We do that through conversations like this, by learning alongside one another, by questioning assumptions and building the very relationships that sit at the heart of this work. And if you find these sessions valuable and would like to stay connected, we'd be very happy to welcome you into our community. We're honoured to be joined today by Dr. Ashley Boat and Heather Poparad for a presentation from Relationships to Resources, Fostering Social Capital Through Positive Youth Development. Ashley is an independent consultant and applied researcher specializing in youth development, mentoring, and social capital. Formerly a senior research scientist at Search Institute, she studies how relationships and community context shape young people's access to resources and opportunities. Her work bridges research and practice to help organizations design strategies that promote connection and thriving. And we're also joined by Heather, who is an applied researcher and youth development professional with a decade of experience working in schools, youth programs, and childcare settings. Her research examines social emotional development and equitable practices for connecting young people to resources and opportunities. Heather specializes in working with organizations to iteratively co-design and test to problems of practice. Welcome, Ashley and Heather, and over to you.
Thank you, Tristan. Well, I'm going to kick us off today. So thank you all for joining us. Today we're going to be sharing what we've learned from a study that was recently published. You can see the paper right here. It's called The Role of Organized Activities in Supporting Youth Social Capital Development, a Qualitative Meta-Synthesis. And this article was written with our former colleagues at Search Institute. Search Institute is an applied research nonprofit that is based in the United States. They partner with youth-serving organizations such as schools and out-of-school time programs to advance the study and practice of positive youth development. If you are interested in learning more about Search Institute, I actually believe a former colleague of ours, Michael Wright, also did a webinar just a couple of weeks ago, and so I know he shared some of the important work that Search and our colleagues there are doing. So I encourage you to definitely check out that webinar as well. Before we dive too deeply into the presentation, I also wanted to note that this article is available open access, so you can download and access this article for free for those of you who may be interested in reading it or digging a little bit more deeply into the details. So we'll try to share a link with you all so that you can access the study after today's session. So before we kick off our presentation, we will give a little bit of a background about what really inspired this study, and then we'll walk through an overview of the study itself and highlight the key findings that emerged from the study, and we'll wrap up with some discussion questions and time for some questions that you all may have. So before we go any further, Tristan gave us lovely bios, which which was wonderful. But I do just want to introduce myself. I'm Ashley Boat, as Tristan mentioned. I am an independent consultant and applied researcher, really focused on youth development. I've done some work in the education space, in the youth mentoring space, and more recently, a lot of my work has focused on youth social capital. But I've worn many hats. I previously was a fourth grade special education teacher in New York, for a number of years, and I've been a former program evaluator, and most recently, I was a senior research scientist at Search Institute. But I always say that relationships is the through line between all of the multiple experiences and research that I've been interested in. It always comes back to relationships and really wanting to understand how we can best support young people in fostering those strong connections. And I'm fortunate enough to be joined here today with my former colleague, Heather. So I'll turn it over to Heather to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Heather Poparad. I am also an applied researcher and I'm a youth development professional. I kind of like to dabble in both research and practice, and I tend to direct my career at the intersection of those two pieces. Um, Specifically, I focus on the development of evidence-based resources to help practitioners improve outcomes for young people and the organizations that they are embedded in. Ashley and I met while we were at Search Institute, and we collaborated on several projects together that focused on how do we help organizations enhance young people's social capital, and that is a big part of the reason why we ended up writing this paper and why we're here talking with you all today.
Thank you, Heather. So the study that we're sharing with you today, and I'd really say much of mine and Heather's work really focuses on adolescence, and really this critical period of development. So, adolescence is really a time when young people are getting the opportunity to explore who they are, where they fit in the world, and what they want their future to look like. Their worlds are often expanding and they're navigating new expectations, new social contexts, and they're really starting to grow a sense of independence. And so, although this is a period where young people are becoming more autonomous, it also continues to really be a period when relationships really matter. Young people are starting to form really strong ties with their peers. And they're also experiencing increasing interactions with other non-parental adults in their lives. This could be teachers, it could be a sports coach, a mentor, and other adults within their community. And during this period of adolescence, it's important that young people are not just building relationships, but they're really developing high quality relationships. And when we talk about high quality relationships, we're really talking about the kind of connections that offer people support. It can be emotional support, it could be tangible or instrumental forms of support, encouragement, as well as real opportunities to try and explore new things that align with young people's interests and passions. These are the relationships that really can help young people navigate challenges and build new skills, as well as really develop a sense of safety and belonging. And these relationships do more than just provide different forms and types of support. They also connect young people to new information. They can connect young people to valuable resources that align with young people's goals. And they can also connect young people to meaningful opportunities across multiple contexts, including school, work, and community life. And so it's in this way that we might see relationships really as a bridge between young people's developmental needs as well as pathways to different opportunities that really align with young people's long-term goals. So, in the study that Heather and I are going to share, we really frame social capital from a positive youth development perspective, also sometimes referred to as PYD. And PYD really starts from the belief that all young people have strengths, they have potential, and they have assets, including relational assets. And so relationships aren't just seen as forms of support. They're really seen as a core developmental need that all adolescents need and are core to helping them really thrive long term. So, from a PYD perspective, the environments in which youth are embedded can support young people in a multiple of different ways. So, they can help young people strengthen relationships and connections. They can also provide meaningful roles and opportunities for young people. And they can also foster skill building opportunities that are really aligned with young people's interests and passions. So, using a PYD lens, we can think about how might we design a youth setting or a youth environment that is really connection and relationship rich, a place where social capital can be built, it can be strengthened, and it can really be mobilized in ways that support youth growth and support youth thriving over time. In the paper that Heather and I are going to talk about, we use this term organized activities. Organized activities is really an umbrella term. And what this is referring to is structured, supervised programs that young people participate in outside of the regular school curriculum. So this could be a lot of things. This can include after school programs. It could include sports teams, arts organizations, mentoring programs, workforce development programs, or other community-based organizations that serve young people. A common thread in these organized activities is that these are really intentional spaces. They are designed with purpose. They involve regular interactions with peers and adults, and they offer opportunities for young people to build skills, explore interests, and form meaningful relationships. So organized activities are powerful because when they are designed well, they can offer consistent and sustainable relationships, often both with peers and adults, really making them ripe to serve as these relationship-centered environments or settings for young people. They can also expose young people to new networks. So, for example, if a young person is participating in a youth mentoring program, a mentor or a program staff member might connect that young person to an internship or an employment opportunity that they may not otherwise have access to if they weren't a part of that youth mentoring program. Staff in these type of organized activities, sometimes in the literature, they've been referred to as institutional agents. I like to think of them more as bridges or as brokers, as individuals that can really help young people navigate systems and explore their interests and passions and really connect them to opportunities that extend even beyond the organized activity or program itself. And it's really this belief that we think makes organized activities uniquely positioned to really support the development and growth of social capital for young people. So, given how important we know both relationships and organized activities are for youth development, we were really interested in understanding how these youth settings actually support the development and growth of young people's social capital. There's been a lot of research on the benefits of organized activities. So, participation in organized activities has often been associated with things such as improved academic outcomes, strengthening young people's social emotional skills related to supporting young people's identity development. And there's been a growing body of research also on youth social capital, particularly in the youth mentoring space. There's a growing body of research that is really showing how youth mentors might be well positioned to support young people in developing and strengthening their social capital. But what we haven't really seen is a clear synthesis of the specific mechanisms within these organized activities that really help young people build and expand their networks. Previous studies have tended to focus on one program or one activity at a time. There wasn't this broader integrative look at what these environments really do to foster social capital across these organized activities and across different youth contexts that young people find themselves embedded in. And so it's really this gap that motivated our study. We really wanted to bring together insights across the field to understand both the relational and structural elements that really help young people develop social capital through organized activities. And so, to explore this question, we conducted what is called a qualitative meta synthesis. This approach allows us to bring together findings from multiple qualitative studies and look across all of them in order to identify common themes. So, we systematically reviewed published research, specifically looking at organized activities and youth social capital. From that body of work, we selected studies that included rich qualitative data and also met our inclusion criteria. Then we analyzed those studies collectively, and rather than just summarizing them, we actually reinterpreted the themes across the studies to really support us in developing new insights and a deeper understanding of how social capital really is being developed across these settings. And so this approach gave us a broader, more integrative perspective than what we could gather from just a single study focused on one particular context. And so we ended up including 33 studies in our final review. And we used this six-step approach, which is outlined here, to analyze the studies and help us develop a conceptual model. And so, if you're particularly interested in the methodological approach, again, I encourage you to check out the article, and you can definitely find more details about the approach there. Oops. And so, I am now going to turn it over to Heather to talk about the key findings.
I think actually we might have skipped one slide.
Oh, did we? Let's see. Can I go back? Yes, we did. All right. Thank you, Heather. Good catch.
So our findings across the studies that we examined suggested that organizational partnerships, supporting structures, a strong relational climate, and staff mindsets and skills contribute to opportunities for young people to access organizational social capital. Further, these opportunities help young people develop the mindsets and skills necessary to build and activate their own social capital as they work towards their life goals. I'll explain each of these findings in more depth, and we will see how these are all interconnected to contribute to experiences that help young people build social capital. So administrators and directors of organized activities form partnerships with other organizations that can increase young people's access to valuable resources. These partnerships create opportunities for career exploration, skill building opportunities, mentorship, financial and material support, and access to basic needs like food and clothing. Um, this quote here on the right describes the benefits of a STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics program that partnered with local businesses, stating, in addition to financial support, STEM businesses provided students, teachers, and parents with access to professional scientists and engineers and cutting-edge science research facilities. By strengthening the organization's social capital within the community, organized activities create pathways for young people to strengthen their individual social capital. Ultimately, they can take the connections that they make within these activities and the skills that they develop, and they could take them beyond their experiences within the activity. I saw one person in the chat was asking how youth is being defined. We are specifically referring to adolescents for this paper. Supporting structures are how organizations align resources, processes, and people to achieve their mission. The studies we examined highlighted three structures that help build positive relationships that nurture youth social capital. The first key structure is retention of high quality staff. When staff stay with organizations for many years, it leads to long-term relationship building and it creates institutional memory. The longer a relationship is sustained, the more meaningful that relationship becomes. Additionally, the more that a staff member knows about an organization, the better connected they are to resources and opportunities within that organization. The second key structure here is the presence of a shared organizational mission and values. This quote describes a high school STEM program with a university affiliate, stating that interactions with university staff and teachers was where program practices and dispositions were shaped to ensure consistency and fidelity between what was said and what was done. So in this case, organizational partnerships actually contributed to greater fidelity in delivering on the organization's mission. And finally, hiring staff with similar identities or life experiences as the youth served can contribute to better relationship building within the organization. A young person in an academic enrichment program reflected on her relationship with a Latina educator who earned her doctorate in education. This young person stated, "She was so inspiring. You look like me, you speak like me, and it's possible." When young people have role models who they can identify with, they increase their ability to envision possibilities for their own future success. Organizational climates that facilitate strong relationship building provide youth with a safe and culturally responsive environment. One after-school program emphasized that youth needed to feel that they had a space where they could express themselves and were safe from stereotypes, belittlement, and intimidation. A strong relational climate also contributes to young people's sense of community and belonging. So, staff from a mentoring program and academic support program told young people, your fellow crew members are your brothers and sisters within the larger program family. By referring to them as members of a family, the staff member is emphasizing that they are all part of a caring system of support. And finally, a strong relational climate contributes to opportunities to explore sparks. A staff member from a workforce development program shared that defining what young people's gifts are, that's what we shoot for. And this illustrates that their organization's purpose was to help young people find their passion. Staff mindsets and skills largely contribute to young people's experience of a relational culture. Studies indicate that these three mindsets and skills nurtured a strong relational culture that had young people's best interests in mind. So, first, we have authentic relationship building skills. So, for example, in one program, staff get to know young people's family and their teachers. They chaperone youth to field trips. They act as interventionists for the youth at their schools and in their neighborhoods. When staff are plugged into different contexts of a young person's life, they have a more comprehensive understanding of that person's life, and they become more embedded in that person's system of support, which overall makes them a more influential person. Additionally, staff need strong brokering skills and they need to believe in young people's potential. In another program, staff draw on the program's connections to identify potential relationships, and they vouch for the youth in to the community adults, putting their own reputations on the line. To do this well, they have to know the young person well. They have to understand the young person's interests and ultimately like what they're capable of. But they also have to have good relationships with people through the organization's connections. In this way, activity staff are the mediating force that help young people access valuable opportunities and resources. Young people's mindsets and skills contributed to their enhanced ability to actively mobilize social capital as they work towards their life goals. So there were four key mindsets and skills that were identified across the studies. First was future orientation. Young people's experiences in these programs help them envision a clear future for themselves. So one young person had shared that my internship definitely opened up my perspective in figuring out what I needed to get out of college. This drove what I would study and prioritize during college. And so for this particular person, their future orientation contributed to greater focus and clearer goals while they were in college. Um, Second, is self-efficacy, which ultimately involves a combination of confidence and skill building. Skills that helped young people develop confidence in their ability to achieve their goals included academic skills, time management, leadership skills, communication skills, and overall relationship building skills. Relationship building skills came up very frequently in the literature and was often described in terms of becoming comfortable establishing relationships with supportive adults and building networks of peers and professionals. These relationship building skills were born out of practice. Organized activities provided opportunities to connect with others, and the staff offered intentional support for how to establish and maintain those connections. So it's not just diving or having young people dive into the deep end and introduce themselves. They had guided support along the way. Finally, a commitment to paying it forward was beneficial for building and contributing to social capital. In one program, a young person who was a mentor to other young people reminded their peers, keep in mind that whatever you guys do, the next cohort sees. What example are you setting, right? Ask yourselves that and take it seriously. When young people see their own growth and recognize the supportive network that helped them, they become more invested in being part of somebody else's support system. So they're not just building their own social capital, but they're contributing to the social capital of other people as well. Close relationships between staff and youth increase access to valuable resources and connections that may not otherwise be available. Staff leveraged organizational social capital and served as brokers to support young people's social capital. Further, staff provided advice, information, and guidance that young people needed to succeed. Reflecting on this support, one young person shared, I don't think I would have as much passion as I do because I know so many people know that I can do it, and I will make them proud. And finally, organized activities provide opportunities for young people to develop the mindsets and skills that they need to confidently act in ways that support their interests and goals. This often involves taking initiative to engage or seek help, even outside of their involvement in the activity. One program highlighted how a young person sustained her relationship with a staff member beyond high school by seeking out help during the summer before her semester in college. Over time, these experiences, skills, and mindsets contribute to young people's ability to effectively advocate for themselves. Because these identified themes are all interconnected and they suggest a potential pathway through which key elements of organized activities can be leveraged to intentionally build social capital, we constructed an empirically grounded model to demonstrate a process which organized activity or through which organized activities support youth social capital development. So organizational partnerships, the supporting structures, and a relationally strong climate create opportunities for young people to develop strong relationships with adults and peers, and it increases access to support, resources, and opportunities. The skills and mindsets that young people develop from these opportunities help them to engage in behaviors to activate their web of support in pursuit of their life goals.
Thank you, Heather, for going through all of those findings. I know there's a lot of them and lots of really powerful quotes from young people. So I encourage people definitely to check it out. There's many, many more quotes that I'm sure Heather could have pulled from, so that's great. Before we move into some of the implications of the key findings that Heather shared, I just wanted to pause and also acknowledge a couple of limitations and potential future directions to further help contextualize some of these findings. So first, the studies included in the meta-synthesis came from a wide variety of organized activities, everything from sports to mentoring to workforce types of programs. And so while on one hand, that diversity can be seen as a strength, it also means that we can't say which specific practices work best in which types of settings. So this is one area where we could dig a little bit deeper into context specific practices and mechanisms that really support young people's social capital growth. So, for example, we might imagine that the way a coach and team members within a sports environment support young people's social capital development and growth might look very different from the way that a mentor within a community-based mentoring program might support young people's social capital development. And so this study looked at a wide variety of organized activities and tried to highlight some common themes that it saw across all of those different contexts. Second, as I'm sure many people on this call have probably dived deep into, social capital is one of those constructs or concepts that can be defined in many, many different ways, and it's used across many different disciplines, whether, it could be used in sociology or economics. And here, we're really coming from a positive youth development perspective and lens. And so that is really how we are articulating and thinking about social capital. But I would even say, even within this youth development space, the studies that we reviewed often weren't using the same language or the same frameworks or even really defining or describing social capital in the same way, which can make comparison very challenging. And so I think there's, a unique and real opportunity there for the field to continue to get clearer and more conceptually precise in how we define and think about social capital and how that might look across developmental stages. So what that might really look like for a young person. Third, the conceptual model that Heather shared, it came out of this synthesis, but it is really just a model. So it has not been empirically tested. It's really just grounded in the themes that emerged across these studies. And so it would still need to be empirically tested across different programs. And then finally, most of the studies focus on relationships within a single program context. But we know that young people's networks extend across different contexts. So they have networks that extend across home and their school environment, their community, their work, as well as participation within an organized activity. And you could even see one of the themes that Heather highlighted was about this cross-sector partnership, where some of these organized activities that were particularly well positioned to support young people's social capital development, that they were forming partnerships with other contexts. So a program might form a partnership, for example, with a business or an employer to give the young people in that program additional access to opportunities and resources. But there hasn't done, a ton of research to explore how these broader networks all interact with one another to really support young people's social capital across really the entire ecosystem. And so I think there's additional opportunity there to really think about how these organized activities are connecting with these other broader networks within the young person's life. Um, Additionally, the findings point to several important implications for practice and additional future work. So, first, organized activities aren't just places for youth to build skills. They're also really relational ecosystems. Programs can be intentional about creating relationship rich and connection rich environments where young people can build close, supportive relationships as well as connections that really bridge them to new people, communities, as well as additional opportunities. Second, one of the findings that emerged from the synthesis was that adults within these organized activities often play a really powerful connector role. And so, one of the things that we're thinking about is how can staff be better supported to not only build really strong relationships with the young people in the program, but also to be able to connect them to valuable resources and new connections and different opportunities that really align with those young people's interests and sparks in ways that are safe. Um, Third, when organized activities do provide sort of meaningful real world opportunities that align with young people's passions, whether that's an internship or a service project or a leadership role, it really gives young people the opportunity to practice agency, to build social skills as well as interact with other adults and peers outside their usual circles, which again helps them develop the skills to really strengthen their social capital and mobilize their social capital in pursuit of their long-term goals, whatever those goals might be. And then finally, as I sort of alluded to in the last slide, um, social capital doesn't just happen within a single program, and so the cross-sector partnerships that these organized activities developed with schools, employers, community leaders, and families of young people can really expand young people's network of adults and peers that they can really draw on as they're pursuing those goals. So how can we, better strengthen those cross-sector partnerships across young people's ecosystems to really make sure that young people are getting the support that they need. All right. There's also a couple of implications for policy and research that we can also think about. So first, policymakers and funders, I hope continue to recognize that relationships really are a foundational asset that young people need. And so investing in youth programs is not just about the curriculum or the content of the program, but it's also really about cultivating relationships that can really give young people access to opportunities and guidance and networks. And so programs, in order to do that effectively and to do that really intentionally, they really need the infrastructure and the staffing supports to intentionally create a relationship-rich environment. And so that means investing in staff training and providing consistent funding so that relationships really can be sustained over time. Second, it's important to ensure broad access to programs. So we were highlighting some high quality, really effective, organized activities in the synthesis. But not all young people have access to these type of programs. And so thinking through what policies and practices might be put in place and designed in a way that supports all young people having access to these programs. So that might be thinking more intentionally about transportation or cost or what opportunities might be available in young people's communities. so that all young people really have access to these high quality environments. Finally, for the research community, there's also additional need for more longitudinal and multi-context studies that really test the conceptual model that's emerging from this synthesis. Future research should measure, how social capital develops across different program types, different youth program types, across different stages of youth development. I know Heather mentioned somebody asked about youth and how that was being defined. For this study, the inclusion criteria was 14 to 24, so it does as that critical adolescence window, but also some emerging adults as well. And so there may be some differences between those two developmental stages as well to think about. But doing this additional research can really help us translate these findings into real world outcomes that hopefully benefit young people and support their long-term thriving. All right. So I'm going to actually turn it back over to Heather to share, I guess, some food for thought.
Um, so we have these discussion questions here that we are just curious of people's initial thoughts, perceptions after what you just listened to. Um, what do these findings suggest about how young people build social capital? Which mechanisms seem most important for building social capital? How do the findings align with your experience in schools or programs, or perhaps what surprised you or challenged your assumptions? If anybody is interested and willing to come off of mute and share your response to one of these questions, we'd love to hear and sort of engage with what you've been thinking about.
So feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to pose some responses to any of these questions, or alternatively, you can post in the chat. And then when we call upon you, you can unmute yourself to ask a question. Or if you're in a noisy or busy environment, or you don't want to talk for any reason, just let us know, and I'll happily read out your question or comment on your behalf. Just let me know in the chat. So I'm particularly interested in number 4. If anyone has any ideas about what was surprising or challenging in terms of the presentation today.
Hi, Tristan, this is Stephanie Davison. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. I'm on my phone, and so I never quite know how to operate things. I would come off, I don't know how to make myself visible. Anyway, I was curious. I missed the beginning, so I apologize. I missed about the first 15 minutes, but I'm curious about so maybe you've already answered this about because positive youth development, so the alignment of PYD, belonging and caring and youth adult partnerships, it aligns sort of in some ways pretty closely with social capital. So I'm wondering how you're distinguishing between the two and deciding, what's a PYD process versus what is social capital building? And I apologize again if you've already spoken to this.
Thank you for that question. And Heather, also feel free to come off mute and I can give a stab to that. So we kind of did talk about this a little bit at the beginning, but Heather and I come really from a positive youth development background and perspective. And so that perspective is really how we define and articulate social capital. So we talk about social capital as the resources that arise from a web of supportive relationships that young people have access to and can mobilize in pursuit of their long-term goals. That's a bit clunky, but that has kind of been the definition that we've used for social capital. And I would say that the practices of PYD So, creating a strong sense of belonging, fostering strong relationships between young people and peers and adults. Those are all practices that really can contribute to young people really building a strong web of relationship that can provide access to those valuable resources that really align with their goals. So I don't think that they're at odds with each other at all. I think they're actually very complementary. And so we do take a strength-based approach when we think about social capital. And so one of the things that we also say is, all young people have social capital. It's not something that you have or don't have. All young people have it. And so how can we help strengthen and grow that social capital for young people, whether that's building strong relationships with them, helping them identify those people within their network or within their web of support who can support them in getting access to different information or resources that they might need. And so I hope that somewhat answers your question. I don't know, Heather, if there's something you would add to that.
Yeah, I'm very much in agreement, but I would also add at least one of the ways that I sort of consider the distinguishment between PYD and social capital is in thinking about like the overall outcomes. We consider social capital as supports, resources, opportunities, skill building towards the achievement of life goals, whereas positive youth development focuses on a much broader range of outcomes. And I think presently there is a lot of attention paid to mental health outcomes in positive youth development research and practice right now. Again, there's always relationships between like mental, emotional, and even physical well-being with achievement, but they are often examined as separate things.
Would it be fair
Okay.
to say then that perhaps social capital is an outcome of PYD, or one of the outcomes of PYD, at least in terms of young people's ability to be able to both build and use the social capital that they have?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
So in amongst all of these activities, do you think there's a role for helping young people to reconnect with the importance and value of social relationships, basically to understand social capital better, even if they're not using the term social capital? And perhaps that's one of the most effective ways to help young people to build their social capital is to help them to understand it, both in terms of how it functions, but also the value that it has.
Yeah, and this is interesting because when we have spoken with young people about their thoughts, their perceptions, their understanding of social capital, oftentimes they push back at the transactional nature of the language that is being used. And so I think in terms of helping them understand what social capital is about and what is the value of nurturing social capital, it also takes a substantial amount of reframing that it's ultimately about relationships and how do you connect with other people in supportive ways and how are you able to build relationships with people who you can go to when you need help and who you can support when they need help as well. Um, I find that when we step away from this idea of like, oh, we're just networking to get something out of somebody, then young people tend to be a lot more receptive to these concepts.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Heather said. So, not in this study, but in other studies that we were a part of when we were at Search Institute, we did do some qualitative data collection with young people to better understand sort of what they thought social capital was. And there does tend to be sort of a negative connotation associated with that term. It is pretty jargony. And one of the things that young people what seemed to resonate for them more was when we kind of described it as your web of support. This you have this web of different relationships that can provide access and resources to different things that are really aligned to what your long-term goals are. I do think, it can be seen as something that is very transactional. But we also, I think one of the ways to help reframe that is also thinking about the element of reciprocity that goes into that. And so, one of the themes that came out was this commitment to paying it forward. And so we're not just, developing a relationship to get information and then we move on from that relationship. We're trying to cultivate a strong relationship. And part of that is also me as an individual contributing and giving back, building a bi-directional relationship and giving back to the community and web of support within my own network. And so I think that is another opportunity to help get rid of some of maybe the ick factor that can come along from the term social capital.
And I've seen that ick factor as well. But of course, as we know, social capital doesn't work when it is exploitive or even really transactional, because as a durable stock, as something that we can invest in, a transaction isn't really going to leave behind anything that's beneficial for future. So you can't build social capital by being exploitive, and maybe you can a little bit by transactions, but really you only build it by paying it forward. That's really how you build the stock of social capital. But people still react to the capital terminology in a way that suggests that it's very selfish or instrumental or exploitive. And also I've seen a lot of young people in many places around the world really push back against ideas associated with nepotism as well, that they might receive some sort of unfair advantage because of family or friends or contacts that they have, without recognizing that it's not about unfair advantage, it's about opening opportunities. And so a lot of it is about the framing. So I'm interested from both of you where you see the benefits of social capital. You've embraced the concept, as have I, of probably most of the people on this session use the concept of social capital because we find it useful. But where do you see its greatest strengths, and where are the greatest weaknesses, and how do we try and overcome those weaknesses and try and message it in a way that's actually going to be powerful and beneficial?
I think in the context of working with young people and adolescents in particular, the greatest strength is helping them recognize that they have community, that they have people who have their back. I have worked with quite a number of adolescents who freeze when they are facing a major life problem because they don't know what to do and they don't know who to go to. Um, and they're actually in one of the projects that Ashley and I had worked on, we were developing a resource to help young people map their network of support. And when we were getting feedback from young people, uh, probably the most frequent bit of feedback is, well, what if I don't have anybody? So I think the greatest benefit of social capital is just helping young people recognize that they have people even when they don't think that they do. Even if they don't necessarily have a close, intimate relationship with another person, that doesn't mean that there isn't somebody in their community who is willing to show up for them and have their back. Um, Actually, I'm curious if you have some additional thoughts.
I think I would just, I think you said it beautifully. I think I would echo everything that you've really shared, Heather. That all resonates.
So we still have a bit of time if anybody has any questions or comments that you'd like to pose. They don't have to be just the questions you're seeing on the screen right now. They can be anything that you'd like to pose, any related kind of topics and ideas you want to share. Feel free to either post in the chat and I'll be happy to read it out on your behalf, or raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. You'd be very welcome to get involved. And I think that, Heather, the point you made about young people have a lot more social capital than they often realize is a really important one. Ed DeJesus from Social Capital Builders in Maryland, he talks about this quite a lot, that when he works with young people and identifying their social capital, they often say, well, I don't have anybody. But exactly as you said, once they actually start thinking about it and exploring it, they realize they do, through their uncles, their aunts, their family, through their peers, their teachers, and a lot of the people that social capital builders work with might be justice involved. And so even making that kind of more extreme point that even the judge who presided over your case has an interest in your well-being, and maybe that's somebody who you could reach out to. But people, of course, don't think about these kinds of connections that they have. So perhaps that's part of the role of helping people to understand social capital, is just helping them to understand how much they actually have, so that it can be activated and mobilized much more in the pursuit of things that improve their life.
Just one reason to stay connected to Search Institute. We actually, Heather and I, as part of a different project, got to develop an activity that mentors can do with their mentee, and it's called Identifying Connections. And so it really aligns well with what Tristan was just describing, where we give they have little cards with different scenarios that could happen. So perhaps, oh, I got a bad grade in this class. And then they have some prompts that they go through to help identify, well, who could I go to help me with this scenario? And so we pilot tested this with young people and mentors, and it really did help open young people's eyes to see, like, oh, I do have this person that I could go to for this thing. Or if I don't, how could I, where might I be able to develop a new connection or relationship that could support me with this specific scenario? And so that might be one activity people look out for if that is of particular interest.
Yeah, and I would say the the biggest challenge in this and potentially the most important role of people who are working with adolescents is um, if a teenager or even a young adult doesn't feel like they know somebody very well, if it's a weak connection, they very rarely have confidence to approach that person for support. They often have it in their mind of like, I don't know this person, they don't know me, why would they help me? And getting them to sort of overcome some of those anxieties is tricky, and it takes a lot of very intentional practice and skill building. And I think a lot of adults don't recognize that, like, we developed those skills for ourselves through actual practice and through making mistakes and through embarrassing ourselves and trying again anyway. And so for people who are working with teenagers and trying to support young people's social capital development, there needs to be a lot of focus on what are the practical steps that I can take with this adolescent so that they have confidence and that they have knowledge for how to approach people who they don't know very well.
I think it's a really important point. In a few other places around the world, there's been a lot of discussion about thoroughly integrating social capital into the entire curriculum, to the point where young people are learning those kinds of skills. They're learning about emotional intelligence and active listening and problem resolution and diplomacy and so on and so on. There's so many of these kinds of skills can really help to build relationships. And I'm curious to what you think, whether or not we really kind of need an overhaul, I guess, of the way in which particularly our primary system, but maybe even our secondary and university systems actually teach people, and the kinds of things that are taught. Is there a place there for social capital?
I think there is a place, of course, especially like in my experience working with schools, every school that I've been a part of has a vested interest in trying to encourage a sense of community within the school and within the neighborhood that the school is embedded in. Uh, how do you develop community without developing a sense of these are people who I can go to when I need help, right? Um, and so yeah, it is one thing to have that feeling of like I have these people around me, and it is another thing to know how to actually act on that. Um, I could see that kind of support being embedded in like social emotional learning programming that is being implemented into schools. I don't know exactly what kind of overhaul you're referring to, and so I'm not sure exactly the level of focus that is needed, if that makes sense.
Well, perhaps provide some context. I did some research in Guernsey last year, and of quite a few of the participants talked about how young people coming out of the school system were utterly unprepared to form the kinds of relationships that we're talking about because they don't have skills, they don't have the awareness, they don't have the abilities to be able to do so. And so they talked about these kind of, systemic or fundamental changes to the education system that rather than just adding on after school program that maybe helps people to with these individual specific tasks, that really trying to integrate the development and create and ability skill building into the school curriculum in terms of kind of a fundamental way is the way that they described it, coming from the realization or the observation that young people leaving the school system are kind of unequipped to be able to form those kinds of relationships.
I think in the United States, at least within the school system right now, the place where social capital seems to be getting some traction is more in the career technical education space. That's where we've seen it kind of pop up more. Ideally, we would like it more embedded. A lot of Search Institute's work focuses on like practical ways to foster strong student-teacher relationships. But even that, honestly, at times is hard because it feels like another thing on top of like making sure that, students can read and do math and do all these other things. And so I think it's a yes, and there's a lot of challenges. To really embedding it thoughtfully in a way I think that everybody, feels committed and feels like they have the know-how of how to integrate it thoughtfully. And then not to mention, AI is like the next thing, and like, what implications is that going to have for social connection, and relationships, and how is that going to be embedded in schools? So, it's a big question that unfortunately don't have to have the best answer for, but yes, and how do we do that well? I guess is the question.
Yeah, it certainly seems like a challenge. So there's a comment in the chat from Liana. You feel free to respond, either Ashley, Heather, if you have a comment to add on to this. I understand that the findings suggest that social capital is not just a passive asset, but it's an intentionality and active learning. Young people don't just access a network, but they intentionally participate in activities and programs where they know they will make good connections and where they are actively taught how to leverage those contacts to achieve their goals. So if you have a comment in relation to that comment, feel free to chime in.
I think a big part of approaching this with a positive youth development lens is um, how we frame young people within these dynamics, moving away from the idea that adults are the suppliers of the things that young people need, and instead moving towards this idea that young people have what they need within themselves, and they might just need a little bit of support in nurturing those qualities, those skills, those abilities, the confidence to be able to live up to their potential. Um, Ashley, do you have additional thoughts?
Let's move on to the question from Stephanie, because perhaps it's a little bit related. Where do families fit into these programs, and how do they fit into the idea of social capital acquisition?
Yes, families are a key part of young people's web of support. And we did see that some of the organized activities in the study that really were intentionally thinking about how to foster young people's social capital were building very intentional partnerships and relationships with young people's families. I think sometimes families is left out of the conversation, unfortunately. But this is definitely one of those relational assets that young people have and are a key part of a young person's web of support that really should be included and talked about, and thinking about how schools and organized activities can really partner more closely with families to support young people.
Yeah, and there's also a comment in the chat from Diana who says, I'm curious about the development of social capital for youth in residential care within the child protection system. I note that often these young people do not have access to relationships and hence opportunities and resources.
Yeah, I think it is tricky, especially in contexts where young people might be moving from facility to facility or from facility to home back to facility, or end up bouncing around to different schools. How how do they sustain relationships long term that will continue to be supportive? Ultimately, I think there needs to be better social services and more programming and support to ensure that these particularly vulnerable youth have the resources and not even just that, like the care and love and attention that they need to develop skills and really recognize their role and situation within a greater community. I'm not sure that I fully answer that question though.
Ashley, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, we didn't, in the current study, we didn't look at young people in residential care, and I don't think, I'm not familiar of other research that has, but there very well maybe, but I think, Heather's points are spot on, so that might be an opportunity to further explore.
So
That
we still have a
it,
little. So
I'm
go ahead,
just
Stephanie.
so I'm following up on that a little bit because that's sort of where my question was coming from, I think, is sort of people who are more marginalized. And so is social capital, is it possible in the I guess it's the chicken and the egg question, kind of like, are people who are entering these programs, and you talked about them as being high quality programs, already poised with high levels of social capital, if you will? It kind of goes back to that whole James Coleman, I think, argument. But and and then if so, like how would someone who's less poised for that, like someone in living in residential care, for example, what are the mechanisms to increase that person's social capital despite the fact that they don't have the kinds of support that someone in a high quality program would have? And I guess I don't know that you can answer that question, but I think it's a an important question because it's not just about those kids, but it's about social capital acquisition in, outside of a very structured, high quality program, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
A number of the studies that we examined involved programs that intentionally serve youth from low-income backgrounds. And so to that end, their families have fewer financial resources. And in the descriptions of at least a few of those studies, it was clear that by being part of these activities, the young people were exposed to possibilities and opportunities that they otherwise never would have even dreamed for themselves. So I think, you know, there is a place and these programs exist that are very intentionally serving communities that are not necessarily like well endowed with social capital already. Um, However, and I don't know this for certain, but I would suspect that high quality programming is likely more prevalent in communities that are already well connected and well resourced.
Ashley, anything you want to add?
I was also just going to highlight there is one, if you're particularly interested in young people experiencing residential care, it just came to me, there's one program called Fostering Healthy Futures. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that's a positive youth development program that connects young people with a mentor. And so that's one way that they're providing sort of this long-term relationship that the young person has, even as they potentially are going in and out of different home environments. So that might be one to talk about, but you definitely raise an important question. I also don't think, organized activities, specifically in the study, that's just one way or one avenue to support young people's social capital development, but young people are also a part of a larger ecosystem, relational ecosystem. So that does include um, potentially the school environment, the community with which they're embedded. It could even be, a faith based community that they're a part of. Unfortunately, these different ecosystems aren't necessarily always interacting and talking to each other to really think about how they can work together to better support all young people, to make sure that all young people are really finding ways to grow and strengthen their social capital. So I think that's something where there's probably a lot more work and thought to be done.
Yeah, these are certainly very important questions that we're talking about right now. And as we know, social capital does tend to reinforce privilege. So if you already have privilege, if you're already in a well-off position, you often have a lot of social capital, and that can reinforce it. And of course, the opposite is true if you don't. And so trying to understand how we might be able to intervene in that process to make more equitable outcomes is, of course, really, really important. So we do have a little bit of time still if anyone would like to get in and ask any final questions. I just saw a comment just pop in just now. Maybe youth in residential care can create their own network protection. Yeah, I guess that is a possibility, but again, it's difficult for young people to take those kinds of initiatives. Uh, so while we've got a little bit of time for questions, if you have any final ones, make sure you get them in really, really soon, because we'll look to wrap up shortly. I wonder, in terms of a final thought, Heather and Ashley, if you were relatively unconstrained by time and resources, what do you think is the next step in this space? What needs? I know you talked about possible research, future research and implications, but what if you could do something in this space? What would it be? What's on your wish list?
I mean, so this makes me think of like while we were at Search Institute, Ashley and I and others collaborated on the development of a measurement platform, initially conceived to consider how can schools and youth programs measure social capital outcomes and connect their findings to supports for like how do they improve those outcomes within their settings? How do they enhance the resources that these organizations can provide? How do they support educators and staff members in knowing how to serve as effective brokers for young people? How do they bring young people into this puzzle piece and figure out how to leverage their own assets as well? Um, I think I would like to continue building on that. Like, how do we bring this from the research world into practice? Currently, in order to make these things happen, finances are often a barrier. Time is often a barrier. Uh, Capacity and people's workload is often a barrier. If there are ways to circumvent that, I think this could be one of those ways where um, we can bring communities together so that they're working smarter and not harder.
Yeah. Interested to hear from Ashley as well. And then maybe a follow-up question from both of you is how do we message this to funders in a way that can help perhaps to gain more funding? So Ashley, what do you think the next steps are?
Oh, that's such a tricky question. I mean, I've alluded to it a little bit, I think, throughout, but I think the thing that I've become more and more interested in understanding both from a research perspective, but also how do we do it in a practical way is really around cross-sector partnerships. I just think there's so much opportunity, particularly in the US, if we can really a lot of our research and work has focused on sort of the out of school time space, but how do we really bridge schools and out of school organized activities together and our health system together in ways that we are all working as a community to really support this strong relational ecosystem that really supports long-term growth and thriving for young people. I know that's like eye in the water, but you said no constraints. And so that's where I wish we could go. In terms of funding, uh, that I think showing the value of social capital for young people. I know lately there's been a lot focused on economic upward mobility, and so sometimes when you can show to funders sort of the link of supporting young people and really building and cultivating this strong web of support and how that is linked to young people reaching sort of their long-term goals, that can be a powerful argument for funders. So that might be one idea.
Are there any ideas?
Um, I'm not sure if I have additional ideas so much as Ashley's response reminded me of Philip Steegman's current focus right now. He's trying to get some funding for a very large, and in some ways pie in the sky project of, how do we bring communities together to really focus on a host of positive developmental outcomes for young people. Um, and I believe part of their approach in attempting to get funding is to show the economic benefit to communities that is like very far downstream.
Yeah, and it seems like by now we've got an enormous amount of empirical evidence of just how important social relationships are for young people. So the challenge doesn't seem to be the lack of evidence so much, but compiling it and communicating it in a way that funders then can respond to. And that seems to be the ongoing challenge that I think perhaps we're all working towards. And the more we can share the ideas about how we can do that, I think the better off we'll be in terms of supporting each other's initiatives to get funding and more action in this space, which I think everybody on this call, again, would agree is vitally important because we understand just how important and valuable social capital is. There's also a comment in the chat I'd just like to share. Elena says it's a very important discussion that we're having here. I'm from the Ukraine, and social capital plays a pivotal role in our reality in Ukrainian society during the war. Thanks for the webinar. Thanks very much, Elena, for joining us. Hopefully you found some insights in the conversation that we've had today. So any final thoughts you'd like to share, Ashley or Heather, before we wrap up?
Just that we appreciate this opportunity, and these were some really interesting and thought-provoking and challenging questions that we got to sort of chew on together.
Yeah, we really appreciate the time you've taken to give this webinar. This is a really important topic, and so we really appreciate the time you've taken and, of course, the discussions that we've been able to have afterwards. And when we finish the session, I'll stop the recording and I welcome everyone to stay online just for a couple of minutes for some informal connection, and perhaps we can see if there are any opportunities for connection or for collaboration that we might be able to form as a result of this webinar. See if we can build some social capital from our social capital webinar. And this is the last webinar of the year. We've had a fantastic and busy year, and we're looking forward to kicking it all off again next year, and of course to our conference in Dubai in March as well. So thanks very much, Ashley and Heather. I'll stop the recording, but feel free to stay online if you'd like to for a few minutes.